Assalamu alaikum, I'm your host Mahin Azam Khan. Today we're following a chain that begins far out in the Pacific Ocean and ends in our fields, our markets, and our meals. To understand why the weather has felt so strange in 2025, we have to start with a simple question. What is El Nino and why is it suddenly behaving erratically? Think of the tropical Pacific as the engine room of the world's climate. Under normal conditions, strong trade winds blow from the east to the west along the equator. They push warm surface water towards Indonesia and Australia, while cool water rises near South America. This pattern, warm in the west, cooler in the east, helps set up familiar rainfall belts and wind patterns across the globe. And El Nino is what happens when the pattern relaxes. The trade winds weaken, warm surface water that is usually piled up in the western Pacific starts to slide back eastwards towards the coast of Peru and Ecuador. The central and eastern Pacific become warmer than normal. When the ocean heat shifts, the atmosphere above it shifts too. Storm tracks move, jet streams bend, regions that usually get rain may dry out, places that are normally dry may suddenly flood. The opposite phase is called La Nina. In La Nina years, the trade winds strengthen. Warm water is pushed even further west. The eastern Pacific becomes cooler than average. That again changes where rain falls and how winds blow. Together, this flip flop between El Nino, La Nina, and the in between neutral years is called ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. It normally swings every 2 to 7 years. In a classic El Nino, the warm phase builds up, stays in place for 9 to 12 months, and then slowly weakens. The global picture is fairly well known with extra rain and floods along parts of the west coast of South America, drier, hotter conditions in Indonesia, the Philippines, northern Australia, and parts of South Asia, and a tendency for hotter global temperatures overall, adding about zero point 0.2 degrees Celsius on top of long term warming. It's disruptive, but it has a rhythm. And this year, that rhythm has been broken. In 2025, El Nino started to develop, but instead of staying strong, it began to weaken earlier than expected. Forecasts now suggest we're sliding out of El Nino into a weak La Nina, or at least neutral conditions with the possibility of El Nino returning again as soon as mid 2026. So instead of a smooth, long, warm phase, we're seeing a fast shuffle. Warm, then fading, then cool, then potentially warm again. Why is this happening? Well, part of the answer is natural variability. Ocean temperatures below the surfaces have shifted in ways that encourage cooler water to rise and push the system back towards La Nina. Winds in the atmosphere have also changed, nudging the pattern along. But there's another layer: climate change. The world's oceans are warmer than at any time in our records, not just at the surface, but deeper down. That background warming means the old relationships between sea temperature, winds, and rainfall are less reliable. Scientists also point out irregular features like the maiden Julian oscillation and bursts of westerly winds that now interact with ENSO in more chaotic ways. Instead of a clean swing from one phase to another, we get jerky, unpredictable motion. The result is not just warmer or colder, but more volatile behavior. The timing, the strength, and transitions of El Nino and La Nina are becoming harder to predict. We're already seeing the fingerprints of this in different parts of the world. Southeast Asia has leaned drier and hotter than expected, with increased risk of forest fires and haze. Parts of the northern United States have had unusually snowy conditions, while the Pacific Northwest has been milder and less snowy than normal. Eastern Africa has faced irregular rainfall, swinging between dry spells and heat waves that unsettle farming and water supply. Odd forests have appeared in some farming regions that normally rely on stable, mild conditions. All of these are signs of a climate system under stress, where a familiar pattern like El Nino no longer behaves in a familiar way. When we come back, we'll leave the open ocean and follow the story into the monsoon belts and farming regions. that depend on steady, reliable rain and are now facing anything but. We've met the disturbed engine of the climate system out in the Pacific. Now let's see what that disturbance looks like when it arrives over land. In the monsoon clouds over South Asia, the dry forests of Southeast Asia, and the fields that depend on them. For billions of people, the monsoon is not an abstract system, it's the difference between a good harvest and an empty storehouse. In 2025, the South Asian summer monsoon did not arrive in a simple way. Rain came in sudden, violent bursts. Cloudbursts triggered flash floods and landslides. Mountain valleys were cut off. In Punjab, on both sides of the India Pakistan border, flood water spread over large areas, leading to thousands of reported weather related incidents, deaths, and displacement. In the high mountains, warmer air intensified glacial melt. Extra meltwater ran into rivers already swollen by heavy rain, adding to flood risk. At the same time, the large scale monsoon winds that normally put moist air inland were weaker. So we had more moisture in the air because of a warmer climate, but weaker, more confused circulation. That combination created a new kind of monsoon. More water overall, but less order in how it fell. Meanwhile, further southeast, countries like Indonesia and the Philippines faced the opposite problem. Instead of heavy rain, they saw suppressed monsoon showers, long dry spells, and hotter days. Soils dried, rivers and reservoirs dropped, forests became more flammable, smoke haze from fires began to threaten health and visibility. Within the same broad climate event, one region was drowning while another was drying out. So, even in one season, farmers are caught between too much water and too little, and the old patterns they relied on no longer hold. And these patterns didn't stop at Asia's shore. In Pakistan's agricultural heartlands, Punjab and Sindh, the mix of delayed rains, sudden downpours, and long hot spells made it hard to follow normal planting calendars. Wheat, rice, and maize farmers struggled to decide when to sow. Many gambled and many lost. Drought and heat in southern Africa, including Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Namibia, and Angola, turned this El Nino cycle into one of the region's worst dry spells in years. Planting windows passed with little rains. Crops wilted, pastures dried, farmers watched livestock weaken. Elsewhere, like parts of Brazil, weather swung in unsurprising ways. Cold snaps and unusual frost over coffee regions, heavy rain in some zones and dryness in others. None of this fits the neat textbook picture of El Nino. Underneath, water systems were under intense pressure. In Pakistan, reduced snowpack and changing glacial melt patterns meant less predictable flows in the Indus River system. Major reservoirs such as Tarbela and Mangla dropped to worrying levels just when farmers needed the stable irrigation for their crops. Groundwater pumps had to run harder and deeper, putting aquifers under stress. Across Southeast Asia, prolonged drought in key farming areas lowered rivers and reservoirs. Some farmers delayed planting, hoping for rain that came late or not at all. Others planted on time only to face dry spells at crucial growth stages. In parts of the southern United States and Mexico, extra rainfall did arrive, but it came unevenly, heavy in some places, light in others, making it difficult to plan water releases from dams or manage irrigation schedules. And so a clear pattern emerges. The issue is no longer how much rain falls in a season, but when it falls, how hard it falls, and how long gaps in between are. For rural communities, that uncertainty is often more damaging than simply being wet or dry. So far, we've seen a disrupted El Nino turn monsoons into a high risk gamble and push rivers and reservoirs away from the patterns we built our farms around. To understand what all of this actually means for people working the land, we put this to agriculturalist Ghasharib Shoukat, who works closely with farmers on the front lines of these changes. Hi Ghasharib, thank you so much for joining us today. So Ghasharib, this 2025 monsoon has brought floods in some areas and droughts in others. In practical day-to-day terms, can you explain what does it actually mean for farmers on the ground?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. And getting into it, the floods of 2025 were a little bit of an anomaly because we had three different weather patterns that were impacting the country at the same time. So what we need to understand is that in the north, in the earlier half of the summer, you saw a lot of glacial melt, and that's when KPK and Gilgit-Baltistan were being impacted. And then in the second half, obviously you had the traditional monsoon, which was just bringing its rains. But what was not factored in was that it was an abnormal monsoon, and that India was also releasing water at the same time. So usually floods tend to impact like South Punjab or Sindh after the Indus River and the Panchayat when the five rivers meet. But this flood was different in that it was affecting Punjab, upper Punjab, because India's dams were full, so they were releasing water without sort of providing information on how much water they're releasing. Because यहाँ पर भी बारिश हो रही थी and वहाँ पर भी बारिश हो रही थी, because obviously like weather systems do not differentiate between borders, right? There's no concept of that. So Upper Punjab was greatly impacted, mainly in the regions where basmati is grown. So like Sialkot, Narowal, Sheikhupura, we saw parts of Lahore were also submerged. And farmer experience in a day-to-day was that those who hadn't experienced a flood like this in Punjab were really shocked and surprised, and they didn't quite know how to handle it because they hadn't seen something like this in their lifetimes before. So for a lot of the people, it was quite a shock, and they didn't really know how to deal with it. So then they had to sort of make ad hoc adjustments, like they had to make bunds, which are dikes, and then, like do sort of temporary fixes to get things sorted. But they were caught unaware, basically.
After the break, we'll walk into fields and orchards. We'll look at what all of this means for harvests, from rice and wheat to coffee and cocoa, and how new pests and diseases are taking advantage of the chaos. We'll do that with more insight from agriculturist Ghasharib Shoukat, who will join us to explain what he's seeing crop by crop and how farmers are trying to cope. So far, we've been talking about El Nino, La Nina, and how this strange stop start pattern in 2025 has disrupted monsoons and water systems across the world. But for most people, this story really becomes real in one place, on the farm. What does all of this actually look like for the people who plant, water, and harvest our food? To answer that, we're now joined by Ghasharib Shoukat, an agriculturalist who works closely with farmers and follows how climate change is reshaping agriculture on the ground. Thank you so much for actually describing this unstable pattern that we saw. We've explained and we've discussed, heavy bursts of rains, long dry gaps, sudden heat waves, and odd frosts that we're actually seeing now in 2025 because of climate change and other factors. So, from where you sit, what are the biggest challenges that farmers are noticing in these fields and in their fields because of this new disrupted climate that we are facing now?
So I think these weather patterns are super erratic, right? So what this ends up doing is that this causes pests that they've never seen before. So अगर मैं rice की example लूँ, in rice there's this pest known as pod. And it's basically when you have like a grain on the rice, but there's no actual chawal, there's no dana inside the chawal, right? So like wheat, this also happens, but it's usually because of heat stress. And for example, the cause of this has been that because of added heat stress, it's led to a decline in yield. So people who've been getting, for example, in rice, average yield of 50 to 55 mounds per acre are now getting a 30% reduction. So somewhere around 35 mounds per acre. So because of the heat stress and changing erratic patterns of weather, it's ended up being that like their sowing patterns and their sowing timelines are impacted because they don't know what the correct time is now compared to traditionally. And they're also faced with new diseases which they haven't really experienced before. So when they haven't experienced something like that, they don't have a solution for it either. So they're sort of like, oh, okay, what do we do now?
That's actually true. Another thing that I want to actually tap into while you described all of the issues and challenges that the farmers are facing right now because of, climate change, is that, we keep on hearing that the old calendar for farmer is no longer working. And we hear this term also, the old calendar. Can you, explain in simple terms for our viewers that how this stop-start rainfall and extreme heat is basically affecting just basic decisions that farmer take, and basic decisions that, when farmers plant and harvest crops such as any crop, rice, maize, or cotton, and what is that exactly doing to the yields?
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is very important to understand first for our viewers to understand how many crop patterns or how many seasons there are. So in Pakistan, there are traditionally two. One is the Kharif, which is in the summer months, right? So technically that starts from like May onwards till like October, November. And then we have Rabi, which is the winter one. And Rabi starts somewhere around October and goes till the end of winter as soon as spring starts. So sort of like April, and then there's a little bit of a intermediary time between the two seasons when the harvest is done, the field is prepared for the next season, and then the crop is sown. So it's very important to understand these two time segments, right? They're not like they're essentially very key to understanding because certain crops are grown according to climatic conditions. So, for example, like rice and cotton are grown in the summer, whereas sugarcane and wheat are grown in Rabi, which is in the winter. So, what used to happen previously, in like what you were saying, the old calendar, was that in between these two seasons, if the farmer had done his harvest earlier, they would be able to plant some vegetables like short duration that they would use for their own substance use. But now, due to the climate patterns shifting so much, a lot of people have just stopped planting short duration crops in vegetables because they're like, we end up facing more loss or we do not get a produce because the weather patterns are changing so much. And now, if you look at maize and rice, these changing weather patterns have really impacted maize yield. And rice also got impacted because of pest concerns. And now lodging has started happening way more than before. Lodging is when there's a standing crop, and because of the wind or because of the extreme climate conditions, if the crop is like this, it just like falls to the ground. So obviously it gets crushed on top of each other. So there are a lot of concerns that have been raised around this calendar. And now farmers are thinking, oh, maybe if we delay our sowing, that will somehow help us. But that actually doesn't do anything for them because when they do end up delaying their survey, it impacts their crop prices and what they end up getting later on. And I'll come to that in a bit. But it's really interesting because now we're seeing winter end sooner and also more heat when they don't need as much heat. For example, when wheat is like about to be ready, they don't need as much heat as ends up actually being there in April and in May. So that causes a lot of issues for the wheat yield, for example, or when wheat is actually available in the market. So these are a few things that have impacted the old calendar vis-a-vis climate change.
You actually also mentioned that, not all crops react in the same manner. And my next question to you is related to that, that in our region and in key farming areas, which crops do you see as the most vulnerable right now to this mix of sudden, downpours, long dry spells, and unexpected heat or cold? And what kind of losses? You also mentioned while you were talking about this before as well, but if you could just touch upon this a little bit more, that what kind of losses in terms of production or quality are you seeing on the ground now?
Yeah, for sure. So I think let's look at it season wise. So in the Kharif season, when the monsoon traditionally takes place in the summer months, we obviously have cotton, right? If cotton fields are inundated with water, you can't really pick. And what happens with cotton, for example, is there's multiple picks, right? They can have up to 4 picks. So, for example, if they've done one pick from the plant, they let it sit and then it'll grow a flower again, and then more cotton will come out. But if the field is inundated and if it floods, they can't go in and pick the cotton, right? So that's a big damage. Rice needs water, yes, but it doesn't need too much water. If you give it more water than it needs, it can get damaged, so the yield can decrease. Maize, corn is grown in both seasons, in Rabi and in Kharif. So maize has also been greatly impacted. And if we look at it in the winter, well, we don't have that much rain in Pakistan in the winter, so wheat is not impacted um, by like flooding, but it's impacted by lack of water. So in the previous years, we've seen that we've had droughts, right? And you've mentioned that. And at certain points in the wheat cycle, irrigation water is not available. So then farmers start praying for rainfall. to come so that their crop gets the optimum amount of water that it needs to grow to that level, right? So these are, if you look at our major crops, sugarcane again is a very big water guzzling crop. So sugarcane is tended to grow in areas where there is availability of water, but that puts the reason why sugarcane puts stress on other crops is because it is so water intensive and so water demanding that other crops will then be impacted because sugarcane needs to be grown. So that's around some of the major crops. If you look at our minor crops, in the 2022 flood, we saw that dates got severely impacted in like Upper Sindh, Khairpur, and Sakhar region, because again, the date farms were like inundated with water. Picking couldn't be done. All the drying of the dates that were already on the ground, they also all got wasted. So that's another example of how crops get severely impacted by climatic changes. And in terms of yields and production, we're seeing overall a decrease in yield, right? So weather changes are so extreme and happening so rapidly that there's no way for a farmer to anticipate. If someone has been doing farming for 25, 30 years, right, they're used to a certain cycle, but that no longer applies. So then they're still going off what they have experienced in the past, but that reality is shifted. So, but their crop cycle or their resistance or their ability to respond to this has not been developed by the stakeholders that have been involved. So they're just really despondent, either in debt, and we're seeing like rising suicide cases as well within growers and farmers across the country because they're just so upset with the situation. And this is sort of demonstrating the fact that most, like 85 to 90% farmers do not want their children to become farmers. So they send them to cities, right? They'll say, go abroad or go to the city and earn a living there because isme koi fayda nahi. So, for example, they know that this is all I know, so I will continue doing this. But they're not put their children through this, or they don't want to put their children through this because they see it as so much uncertainty. And that uncertainty leads them to question whether they want their next generation to even be in this sector, essentially.
So we've heard how unstable weather is disrupting planting decisions, crop choices, and even the soil itself. After a short break, we'll stay with Ghasharib Shoukat and talk about how farmers are trying to adapt, what's working, what isn't, and what this all means for food prices and food security. We're still talking to agriculturalist Ghasharib Shoukat about how climate change and a restless El Nino are reshaping agriculture and our food system. In the first part of our conversation, we looked at what's happening in the fields. Now we want to understand how farmers are coping and what this means for all of us as consumers. Thank you so much for this brilliant analysis. I also want to connect this to something that every viewer feels, which is the price of food. So when harvests they become extremely uncertain, how does you actually mentioned this right now as well? You spoke about what the farmers feel and how they don't want their families to get into this. But if you could just touch a little bit about on this again and about the overall situation of what everyone feels, that how does that impact the farmers' income, farmer debt, and the ability of small farmers to also even survive, and how does that eventually show up as higher or even more volatile food prices for people in cities and for poorer households?
So it depends. A lot of it is connected to international market pricing. And again, it's also connected to the sowing and harvesting calendar. So for example, I'll give you an example. Cotton, for example, when it's picked in the early parts of the season, right? Like when it's first starting to come into the market in May, June, we see that per 40 kg per mound, farmers would get a rate of above 8,000 per 40 kg. But now when we look at that rate for the same quality cotton, because there's so much oversupply in the market, that same quality cotton is selling for 6,000 rupees or 5,500 rupees. So if something that was selling at 8,000 because there was a lack of supply then is now being sold at 5,500, 6,000, it just goes to show you that for the same commodity, the same quality, and 2, 3, 4, 5 months down the road, when the supply is increased, the price will drop. And this is across the board for all the crops, right? Whether it's wheat, whether it's maize, whether it's sugarcane. In the earlier parts of the sugarcane season, sugar mills will be paying, or in the later part when it's short, they'll be paying close to 600 but per mound, right? But when you see that there is ample supply, mills will pay 400, 420. But like input prices have risen, right? So fertilizer that was say 5,000 rupees is now at 13,000 rupees. So जो farmer की cost of production है, that has substantially increased. But the price that they are getting for the crops that they are now producing is still the same as it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So inflation has increased, their cost of production has increased, but the price that they're supposed to get for those crops has not increased. What that tends to do is increase the debt on them. And they are scared of formal financing, whether that's microfinance or whether that's the bank. So they will go to the local financier, which is the Aarti. Now, the Aarti is demonized. I just think that because there is no other option, right? Or there's a lack of trust in growers in another option, they're forced to go to the person they know locally can support them. Now, if the bank is giving you financing at say 17 to 20% per annum, the Aarti will charge you 30%. So he will charge you more. If crop prices are low and if someone did delayed sowing, obviously they're getting a lower rate in the market anyways. When they're getting a lower rate in the market, what ends up happening is they can't pay back the Aarti with cash that they've gotten for even if they've grown a good quality thing, they're not getting the same rate if they've if there's an oversupply of that produce. So they end up having to sell their livestock, or they end up putting that onto the next season. And that's how they sort of balance their payments out. Now, the reason or the problem that in Pakistan, the reason why oversupply happens is because our government prioritizes certain crops and does not prioritize other crops. So, for example, we saw there was a boom in the last 2-3 years of sesame. And because it was going to China, it was being exported, everyone started planting sesame. But the government or someone needs to declare crop zones. कि भाई इस जोन में ये सॉइल कंडीशन है, इस सॉइल कंडीशन के मुताबिक आपको यही क्रॉप्स उगाने चाहिए. जैसे हमें पता है पाकिस्तान is the third or fourth largest grower of dates in the world. A lot of people don't know this. It's just from 2 districts in Upper Sindh, from Khairpur and Sakkar. So Khairpur and Sakkar, 2 districts where most of our dates are grown, are like the largest producers of dates in the world. So why don't you declare that region, if its soil is suitable for date production, as just for date production? Don't allow other crops to be grown there. What's happening on farms across Pakistan is सामने यहाँ गंदम लगी हुई है, उसके ही 5 मीटर दूर गन्ना लगा हुआ है, सामने कॉटन लगी हुई है, पीछे राइस लगी हुई है. So your soil health is not being supported if you're just going to grow different things, right? You need to have crop clusters, and within those crop clusters, you should only grow those crops that are best suited to that soil. And in terms of coming back to pricing, it's impacted by the dollar, it's impacted by international market prices. So what the international market is trading at, that will impact local prices. Price of fuel will also impact commodity prices because that impacts transportation. So if something is grown in a certain area and is transported further away, what ends up happening is that the price of oil or fuel, if it's increasing, the price of the commodity will increase as well.
Absolutely. And I think the situation that we are in right now, currently in Pakistan, with climate change and all other problems that we're facing, crop zoning and, crop clusters is something that, we should really look at, and we should really do some research upon that as well, because that is the forward way to go, because there's a lot of volatility in Pakistan currently. Finally, I just want to wrap this up, and I would like to ask you about solutions at a bigger scale. You mentioned crop clusters and you mentioned crop zoning as well. But if you could just sit down with policymakers and maybe international agency and give them a short list, what are the top 2 or 3 changes that you would push for in agriculture policy, crop insurance, water management, or support for the small farmers to make our food system more resilient to the climate shocks that we know are coming and will keep on coming for the next few years?
So I would say 2 things. The first thing is a water tax, right? In Pervez Musharraf's presidency, they removed the Abhyana tax. पहले होता था हर crop का अलग tax, as in rice is priced differently, cotton. How water intensive that crop is, उसकी basis पे आपको price water की देनी होती है. But now what's happening is a flat rate per acre. Now, if you know sugarcane takes X amount more water than something like cotton to grow, then obviously, like if you are going to give it at a flat rate, areas that are under water stress in South Punjab, they're also growing sugarcane. Recently, 5 sugar mills relocated from central Punjab to Rahim Yar Khan. Rahim Yar Khan is next to the desert. वहां पानी कहाँ से आ रहा है? Obviously, canals के through redivert हो रहा है so that sugarcane can be grown there. So if you're not going to price water and you're not going to tax water the correct way, this will continue to happen. Your Indus River aquifer will continue to lessen. अब पंजाब में जहाँ पहले आप ट्यूबवेल पे बोरिंग करते थे 30-40 मीटर नीचे आपको मीठा पानी मिलता था, अब वही लेवल 200-300 मीटर नीचे हो गया. तो आपको क्या करना पड़ा है, और पैसे खर्च करने पड़े ऑन डीजल to actually allow you to reach that sweet water. And if you're going to dry up your aquifer so fast that is under there in the basin, you're not allowed it to recharge, that it gets recharged through rains and other minerals that come down from the mountains, it's going to deplete faster than it can recover. So water has to be taxed properly. The second thing, which I know the government won't be able to do, but is very, very important to do if you want to support your farmers, is give minimum support price. Not just for wheat and sugarcane, for all crops. Why? Because you give your farmer itna protection and incentive कि जितना उसने पैसा काश्त करने में लगाया है, उसकी जो कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन है वो तो रिकवर हो कम से कम. कि अगर उसको पता है कि यार गंदम लगाने में 2800 या 3000 रुपीज पर एकड़ उसका खर्चा हो रहा है, he should not be paid below that. तो मंडियों में different areas में he should have that minimum support price, and it was there for sugarcane and wheat, but now it's not there because the IMF stipulated that you can't have that. India, on the other hand, has support prices for 27 crops. Last Rabi, they introduced support price for every single crop. So they're giving and backing their farmers, huh? Whereas we have just left it open to market dynamics. Now, wherever there is areas of tension, for example, from the farm to the farm gate, where someone is buying from the farm gate to the mandi, from the mandi to the processor, from the processor to the packaging guy, from the packaging guy to the retailer, those are all points of friction, and everyone's going to keep their cut. So until you don't protect the farmer, everyone else will make money, but the guy growing your food will not.
Thank you so much for telling us these solutions, and thank you so much for joining the show, Ghasharib. Thank you.
This year's El Nino began as a familiar climate pattern, but the way it weakened early and flipped faster than expected has revealed something much deeper. A world where the old rhythms of ocean, atmosphere, rain, and harvest can no longer be taken for granted. From a restless Pacific to unstable monsoons, from fields under stress to food prices on the rise, the story is clear. Climate change is not only warming the planet, it is making our food system more fragile and more unpredictable. The question in front of us is simple but not easy. Can we rebuild that system so it is smarter, fairer, and more resilient than the climate shocks that are now guaranteed? We'll keep following this story and others from the front line of our changing climate. Thank you for joining us. This is your host, Mahin Azam Khan, signing off for Dawn News English.